February 28, 1942. Camp Elliott, San Diego, California. The pencil hovered above the paper as Major James Jones leaned over his desk, eyes narrowing at something that defied every rule of military cryptography he had ever learned. What he was witnessing should have been impossible. Before him stood 4 Navajo men in freshly issued uniforms. They had been recruited only days earlier from Los Angeles. Now, in a cramped communication room filled with static and the smell of coffee and dust, these men were transmitting battlefield messages in less than 20 seconds. Messages that would have taken encryption machines half an hour to process. The words coming through the radio were strange, musical, completely alien to Jones's ears. They rolled together in a rhythm that made no sense, yet the Navajo men listening on the other end understood perfectly. They decoded each message instantly, flawlessly, as if it were second nature. Jones had served 20 years in military communications. He had built his career on the science of codes, on the belief that machines, mathematics, and discipline kept armies alive. He knew how crucial secure communication was. He also knew that Japan's cryptographers had already cracked every American code system then in use. In early 1942, America was fighting a hidden war behind the Pacific Front, one of messages, frequencies, and broken ciphers. Every time a code was broken, American troops died. The Marines were already losing that battle before the first major Pacific landings had even begun. But what Major Jones witnessed that February morning would alter the course of history. What began with 4 men in a small San Diego room would soon expand into a program of over 400 Navajo Marines, creating the only truly unbreakable code ever used in modern warfare. A code so flawless that Japan's own intelligence chief would later confess, "We never even came close." The story, however, did not start in 1942. It began 24 years earlier, on the other side of the world. October 1918. France. The final days of World War I. The mud of the Meuse-Argonne offensive clung to everything: boots, weapons, and the weary faces of American soldiers. Buried deep in the chaos, 8 men from the Choctaw Nation were handed telephones and a simple instruction: transmit orders to the front. They spoke to each other in their native language, a language no one in Europe had ever studied. For months, the Germans had been intercepting and decoding every American message, using the information to anticipate movements and set deadly ambushes. But that day, the German lines went silent. They intercepted the transmissions but could not make sense of a single word. The Choctaw language belonged to the Muskogean linguistic family, spoken only in North America. No German cryptographer had ever encountered it, and there were no written dictionaries to study. The Choctaw soldiers' conversations, simple, direct, and fast, created an instant, unbreakable code. In the final weeks of the war, their improvised linguistic system gave the Allies a critical edge in several operations. But when the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, so too did the memory of their achievement. The U.S. military, eager to return home and rebuild, filed the Choctaw experiment away in forgotten reports. No official program followed. The men returned home quietly, their innovation lost amid the relief of peace. That silence lasted for more than 2 decades, until the morning of December 7th, 1941. December 7th, 1941. The sky above Oahu burned red and black as Japanese aircraft screamed through the clouds. In less than 2 hours, the American Pacific Fleet lay shattered, battleships smoldering, planes destroyed, thousands dead. But the attack on Pearl Harbor did more than cripple America's Navy. It exposed a terrifying truth about American military communications. Japan had been listening for years. Their cryptographers had broken multiple U.S. code systems long before the first bombs fell. The gray code, the brown code, even secure naval ciphers, all compromised. Japan's intelligence services had anticipated this war. They had studied American habits, learned our encryption logic, and dismantled it. By early 1942, U.S. commanders were desperate. The Japanese could intercept a radio message and decode it in hours, sometimes in minutes. Worse, they were using perfect English to broadcast false orders, tricking American units into ambushes. The Pacific Front was becoming a communications nightmare. Major Howard Connor, who would later oversee Code Talkers at Iwo Jima, summed it up with chilling honesty. Every code we used, the Japanese broke. Every cipher, every mechanical device, they cracked them all. America needed something entirely new, something the enemy could never anticipate, could never learn, could never break. That something would come from a man who, at first glance, seemed an unlikely hero. Philip Johnston was born in 1892 in Topeka, Kansas, the son of Presbyterian missionaries. When he was 4 years old, his parents moved to the Navajo reservation in Arizona to begin their ministry. While most white children of that era grew up separated from native life, Philip grew up among the Navajo people. He played with Navajo children, learned their traditions, and absorbed their language as naturally as his own. By the time he was 9, he was fluent, so fluent that he was chosen to serve as an interpreter for a Navajo delegation traveling to Washington, D.C. to petition for tribal rights. By his teenage years, he was one of perhaps 30 non-Navajo people in the world who could speak the language fluently. Johnston later served in World War I, then settled in Los Angeles as a civil engineer with the city water department. By December 1941, he was 49 years old, living a quiet, stable life far removed from the reservation of his childhood. But that peace shattered in February 1942 when he read a small newspaper article that would change everything. The article described a training exercise in which Army units had used Native American soldiers to send messages in their own languages. The experiment had shown promise. To most readers, it was a trivial curiosity. To Johnston, it was a revelation. He knew the Navajo language was unlike any other. It belonged to the Athabascan linguistic family, unique, complex, and virtually impossible for outsiders to learn. It had no alphabet, no written tradition, until missionaries attempted one in the 1920s. The language relied on tone and pitch, meaning that the same sound could carry entirely different meanings depending on how it was spoken. Its syntax was utterly unlike English, Japanese, or any European or Asian language. And while the Japanese and Germans had sent linguistic researchers to study Native American tribes during the 1920s and 1930s, learning bits of Cherokee, Choctaw, and Comanche, no one had ever studied Navajo. The reservation was too isolated, the language too difficult, and its speakers too few. Johnston understood instantly. This was the perfect code. The day after reading that article, he walked into the Naval Recruitment Office in Los Angeles and presented his idea. He proposed using Navajo speakers as radio operators, men who could transmit messages in their native language, turning speech itself into an unbreakable cipher. The officers he spoke to were skeptical. They'd heard strange ideas before. Still, they gave Johnston 2 weeks to organize a demonstration. He immediately reached out to the Navajo community in Los Angeles and found 4 volunteers willing to test his concept. Together, they rehearsed for days, refining how to translate military terminology into Navajo phrasing. Then, on February 27, 1942, the small group boarded a train for San Diego. The next morning would mark a turning point in military history. February 28, 1942, 0900 hours. Inside a communications hut at Camp Elliott, Major James Jones stood beside Major General Clayton Vogel. A few skeptical officers gathered in the background, arms crossed. Everyone expected the test to fail. Johnston divided his 4 Navajo volunteers into 2 teams. 2 men in one room, 2 in another, 50 yards apart, connected by field telephone. He handed the first group a short message written in English. Enemy expected to make tank and dive bomber attack at dawn. One of the Navajo men read it silently, then spoke into the handset in rapid Navajo, his voice steady and sure. Less than 20 seconds later, in the other room, his partner wrote down the translated message in English. Enemy tank and dive bomber expected to attack this morning. Virtually verbatim. No mistakes, no hesitation. The officers stared, stunned. The translation was perfect and instantaneous. Major Jones, who had spent years relying on slow cipher machines, knew that the M94 machine would have taken at least half an hour to encode that same message, and another 30 minutes to decode it. This was something entirely different. General Vogel turned to Johnston. "How many Navajos can you get?" Johnston didn't hesitate. "Hundreds," he said. That afternoon, Vogel dictated a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps recommending the immediate recruitment of 200 Navajos. The letter was dated March 6, 1942. Within weeks, the Marine Corps approved a pilot program, 30 Navajo recruits to be trained as code talkers. If it succeeded, they would expand. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo men boarded a bus at Fort Defiance, Arizona. From there, they were transported to Fort Wingate, New Mexico, and finally to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. These men would soon be known as the Original 29, the first of the Navajo Code Talkers. They endured 7 grueling weeks of standard Marine boot camp. When they graduated on June 27, 1942, they were assigned to Camp Elliott for a new kind of mission, one no military unit had ever attempted before: the birth of the Navajo Code. At Camp Elliott, the 29 Navajo recruits were led into a small classroom. The walls were bare except for a chalkboard, a few maps of the Pacific, and a stack of empty notebooks. Their instructor, Technical Sergeant Frank Shin, gave a simple order. "Gentlemen, you're going to build a code that nobody can break." The Navajo men exchanged cautious glances. None of them had ever imagined such a task. Most of them had been raised in rural parts of the reservation. Shepherds, ranch hands, students from government boarding schools, where they had once been punished for speaking their native tongue. And now that same forbidden language was about to become a weapon of war. They began by translating the essentials, military terms that had no equivalent in Navajo. How did one say machine gun, battleship, or fighter plane in a language rooted in the earth, in family, in the patterns of wind and rain? They decided to invent metaphors, words that made sense to them, that drew from their world. A battleship became lotso, whale. A submarine became beshlo, iron fish. A fighter plane became daheti, high, hummingbird. A bomber was jaysho, buzzard. A destroyer became kalo, shark. Every term reflected the nature of what it described: fast, strong, predatory. Soon the classroom walls filled with hundreds of such translations, written phonetically in English letters. The Marines provided typewriters. The Navajo men provided imagination. But they didn't stop there. They knew that a code made purely of words could still be deciphered with enough effort. So they developed an alphabet system as well, one that used Navajo words to represent each letter of the English alphabet. For example, A equals wulachi, ant. B equals shush, bear. C equals moasi, cat. D equals be, deer. E equals ze, elk. And so on, until all 26 letters had Navajo equivalents. If a word couldn't be translated directly, they could spell it out letter by letter using these phonetic codes. This dual system, a vocabulary code and an alphabet code, made the system virtually impenetrable. Even if an enemy learned Navajo, the structure of the messages would remain meaningless without understanding the underlying substitutions. Within weeks, they had built a working lexicon of 211 coded words, along with the alphabetic fallback system. Everything was memorized. No written copies were allowed to leave the room. The Marines tested the new code by sending sample messages between different stations at Camp Elliott. The results were immediate and astonishing. Where it once took 2 to 3 hours to encrypt, transmit, and decode a message using mechanical ciphers, the Navajo operators could send the same message in under 2 minutes, often in less than 20 seconds. Major Howard Connor, who observed the trials, later wrote, "It was the fastest, most secure means of communication I had ever seen." The pilot group's performance impressed everyone at Marine headquarters. In August 1942, the Marine Corps officially approved the expansion of the Navajo Code Talker program. The new unit would be designated Headquarters 382 Platoon, U.S. Marine Corps Signal Battalion. Recruiters were dispatched to the Navajo Nation. Word spread quickly across the mesas and canyons of Arizona and New Mexico. Young men, many barely 18, rode horses for miles to reach the nearest enlistment office. By the end of 1942, over 200 Navajo men had joined the Marines. Some spoke fluent English, others had learned only basic commands. But they all shared one thing: a deep pride that their language, once suppressed by American schools, was now being called upon to defend the very nation that had tried to silence it. Training was relentless. They rose before dawn for calisthenics, rifle drill, and endurance marches under the desert sun. Then came code instruction, hours upon hours of memorization, drills, and testing. They practiced under simulated combat conditions, sending messages through noise, static, and confusion. Each operator had to recall hundreds of coded terms from memory, translating between English and Navajo instantly, without hesitation. Mistakes were unacceptable. Their instructors soon realized something remarkable. The Navajo recruits were not only quick learners, they were perfectionists. They would not rest until every message was flawless. Once trained, small teams were assigned to Marine divisions preparing for deployment in the Pacific. The first combat test would come sooner than anyone expected. August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal. The jungle was alive with heat and fear. The 1st Marine Division had just landed on the beaches of a name few Americans had ever heard, Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands. The objective was simple on paper: to seize the island's airfield before the Japanese could complete it. In reality, it was a nightmare. The Japanese were entrenched, supplies were scarce, and the thick jungle swallowed sound, light, and men alike. For the first time, Navajo Code Talkers entered combat. They set up radios under palm trees, stringing antenna wires between branches. As the battle raged, messages began to fly back and forth across the island. Requests for artillery, reports of troop movements, calls for reinforcements. The code worked flawlessly. Messages that previously took half an hour to process were now transmitted, received, and decoded in less than a minute. The speed saved lives. Commanders could react instantly to enemy maneuvers, coordinate across chaotic battlefields, and adjust tactics in real time. Japanese signal intelligence units intercepted the transmissions and recorded them. They listened, analyzed, compared, but nothing made sense. The sounds didn't match any known language. Some Japanese officers speculated it might be a dialect from Central Asia. Others thought it might be encrypted gibberish. Whatever it was impossible to break. By the time the Marines secured Guadalcanal in early 1943, the success of the Navajo Code Talkers was undeniable. Reports sent to Washington described their system as unbreakable, rapid, and efficient. The Marine Corps immediately ordered more recruits. By mid-1943, 420 Navajos were serving as code talkers. They were divided among the major Marine divisions, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, each man paired with a partner to operate radios in combat. Their code expanded too. The original 211 terms grew to over 600, covering every possible military need, from weapons and aircraft to months, numbers, and geographic coordinates. To keep messages short, they adopted shorthand phrases Tikin, ice, for north, Shash, bear, for tank destroyer, Tsi-nil, stone, for grenade, Atsa, eagle, for transport plane. Every new mission demanded new vocabulary, and the code talkers created it on the spot. They built a living, breathing code that evolved with the war itself. By 1943, the Navajo Code had become the most secure communication system in the Pacific Theater. From the beaches of Tarawa to the jungles of Bougainville, from Saipan to Peleliu, wherever Marines fought, the voices of the Navajo echoed through the radio waves, calm, steady, and precise. Every transmission carried not just information, but a legacy, the power of a language older than the nation it now defended. February 19th, 1945. The black sands of Iwo Jima burned beneath the morning sun as the first waves of U.S. Marines stormed the beaches. The air was filled with gunfire, smoke, and the thunder of naval artillery. Above the chaos, Mount Suribachi loomed like a dark sentinel. In the midst of that inferno, the Navajo Code Talkers went to work. Each Marine regiment had several teams operating portable radios, crouched in shell holes or behind shattered rocks, their antennas trembling from nearby explosions. They carried only their rifles, radios, and the weight of a language no enemy could decipher. One of them was Private First Class Chester Nez, one of the original 29. He later recalled, "Bullets were flying everywhere, mortar shells bursting. You could barely hear yourself think. But we just kept talking." During the battle, Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, relied entirely on the Navajo Code Talkers to maintain communication across the island. He later said, "During the first 48 hours, I had 6 Navajo radio nets operating constantly. They sent and received over 800 messages, all without a single error. Without them, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The messages came fast, dozens every hour, carrying vital information, troop positions, artillery coordinates, casualty reports, and calls for supplies. The Code Talkers never faltered. Their words guided naval gunfire, directed tank movements, and warned of ambushes hidden within the volcanic ridges. In that brutal, 36-day battle, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed and over 20,000 wounded, but the island was taken. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi became one of the most iconic images in American history. Yet, few knew that the unseen voices behind the victory spoke in Navajo. The expansion of the code. After Iwo Jima, the reputation of the Navajo Code Talkers spread throughout the military. General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith, commander of the Fleet Marine Force Pacific, praised them as the most valuable secret weapon we have. By the end of World War II, over 400 Navajo Marines had served as Code Talkers. They participated in every major Marine operation in the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The complexity of their code continued to grow. What began as 211 words expanded to more than 600, covering everything from ammunition types to top-secret tactical orders. For example, Nehema, our mother, meant America. Tekelechogi, turtle, meant tank. Eiyeshi, little deer, meant Japan. Besh Bichahi, silver bullet, meant aircraft bomb. They even developed specific phrases for months, numbers, and map coordinates, allowing them to transmit detailed battlefield data faster than any mechanical encryption system ever could. The Navajo Code was never written down in full. It existed only in the memories of the men who used it. Every code talker memorized hundreds of terms and practiced until instant translation became instinct. If captured, they were instructed to destroy their equipment and, if necessary, take their own lives to protect the code. But none were ever captured, and the code was never broken. The silence after victory. When the war ended in August 1945, the Code Talkers returned home to the vast plateaus of the Navajo Nation. They came back quietly, carrying no medals, no public recognition, no parades. Their work was classified. The U.S. government ordered them not to speak of what they had done, not to their families, not to their friends, not even to other veterans. The code they had built remained a military secret, officially protected in case it was ever needed again. For decades, the world knew almost nothing of their contribution. Many of the men who had risked their lives in the Pacific went back to tending sheep, ranching, or working small jobs, never revealing that they had once been part of one of the most sophisticated cryptographic systems in history. In 1968, 23 years after the war, the U.S. military finally declassified the Navajo Code Talker program. Only then did the public begin to learn the truth. The revelation stunned historians. Experts confirmed that the Navajo Code had remained the only truly unbreakable code used in modern warfare. Japan's top cryptographers had captured recordings of the transmissions, but despite years of study, they never deciphered a single message. One Japanese intelligence officer after the war admitted, "We couldn't understand the language at all. It sounded like nothing we had ever heard." Recognition and legacy. Once declassified, the surviving code talkers began to receive long overdue honors. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan issued a proclamation naming August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. In 2000, more than half a century after their service, the original 29 were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, while subsequent code talkers received the Congressional Silver Medal. At the ceremony in Washington, D.C., the few remaining survivors stood in uniform, their hair gray, their faces lined with years and silence. They spoke softly, still humble despite the spotlight. One of them, Samuel Sandoval, said, "We never thought we were heroes. We were Marines doing our job. Our weapon just happened to be our language." Their story reached classrooms, documentaries, and even Hollywood films. Yet, for many of them, the greatest honor was the recognition of the Navajo language itself. Once banned in schools, now celebrated as a national treasure. The irony was profound. The same language that the U.S. government had once tried to erase had become one of its most powerful weapons of survival. The enduring code. Even today, the Navajo Code remains unbroken. Linguists have studied it, cryptographers have analyzed it, and historians have marveled at its complexity. But the genius of the system lies not in mathematics or machines. It lies in human creativity, in the living bond between language and culture. The code talkers prove that the very things once dismissed as primitive or obsolete could become the foundation of modern strength. They bridge two worlds, ancient and modern, native and military, and in doing so, they change the course of history. As one Marine general later wrote, "The Navajo language did what no machine could do. It spoke truth faster than the enemy could lie. Today, statues and memorials stand in their honor at Window Rock, Arizona, at the Pentagon, and across Marine bases around the country. Each carries the same message carved into bronze and stone. In war, as in peace, the words of the Navajo have power. Their voices still echo through time, the quiet, steady pulse of a code that saved thousands, a language that outwitted empires, and a people who gave their words to protect a nation that once silenced them. February 28, 1942. Camp Elliott, San Diego, California. That's where it began, with 4 men, 1 idea, and a language older than America itself. And that, truly, was the day the world's most unbreakable code was born.